But ladies and gentlemen, the single most important solution and the way to get these efficiency improvements is to put a price on carbon. CO2 is invisible, tasteless, and odorless. You've heard the phrase out of sight, out of mind. It is easy to ignore if it has no recognized value in our economic system. When risk is ignored, people take more of those risks. When something is not included in economic calculations, then it is ignored. And there are three ways to put a price on it. A CO2 tax that can be given directly back to the people. It doesn't have to increase taxes overall. A cap and trade system of the kind we had hoped would be adopted in Copenhagen is going to be discussed in Cancun, but that system has been objected to in the United States Senate in my country, and I own the I want to acknowledge that my own country should be providing more leadership, has so far failed to provide that leadership. I just want you to know I fully recognize that fact. And the wealthy developed nations as a group need to provide leadership. And since the United States is generally recognized as the leader of that group, and perhaps the nation with the greatest capacity to provide leadership in the world community, it is particularly important that I and my fellow citizens of the United States do a better job in convincing the U.S. government to provide that leadership. But the third way to do it is to regulate CO2 emissions, and that's the least attractive option. But one of these three options has to be adopted. Now, in conclusion, I want to ask you to hear my words not just as an effort to communicate facts, not just as an effort to persuade you. Many of you have long since been persuaded. Many of you have already begun to provide leadership. But my purpose here is to recruit you and to ask you to be a part of the solution. This is the greatest challenge that any generation of people who've ever lived has ever confronted. It's difficult. It's complicated. And that's too bad. It can't be helped. Yes, it's complicated. Subprime mortgages were complicated. That's one of the reasons they were ignored. But it didn't mean that the risk wasn't real. The climate crisis is complicated, but that's no excuse. We have got to use our reasoning capacity and confront this. There's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We have to go far quickly, which means we've got to get our act together. And every nation needs to be a part of it. The developed nations must lead the way. But the developing nations, as a group, as of last year, are now a larger source of global warming pollution than the developed nations. We are in this together. It is one Earth. And we have to come up with a solution. These young people here, in every country, young people get it more and are more eager to do something. And I remember vividly when I was a young boy of 13 years old, and the president of my country at that time, John F. Kennedy, issued a challenge to put a person on the moon and bring him back safely in 10 years. It was so inspiring to me. But I remember after he issued that challenge how many people said, that's impossible, we can't do that. That was unwise. And yet 8 years and 2 months later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the surface of the moon. And as they did so, in Houston, Texas, at NASA's Mission Control, there was a great cheer that went up. And the systems engineers in Mission Control that day had an average age of 26, which means their average age when they heard that challenge was 18. These young people have a right to expect that those of us who are in positions to make decisions today will not wait for them to take leadership in solving this crisis. In fact, the scientists tell us we cannot wait, nor should we, because not many years from now, the next generation will make an assessment of the world in which they live. And depending upon the circumstances in which they find themselves, they will look back at us in our time and ask one of two questions. If they live in a world with hundreds of millions of refugees and nuclear-armed nations like Pakistan destable, with political chaos in developing nations where subsistence agriculture is disrupted, more of these fires and storms and stronger hurricanes and tropical diseases in latitudes where they're difficult to deal with in populations that have no a basis for resisting them, with the sea level rising and the ice caps melting. If they live in that kind of world and feel that their lives are going to continue to get worse and that their children's lives will be worse still, they would be justified in looking back at us and asking us, what were you thinking? Didn't you hear the scientists? Didn't you see the storms and the melting of the ice? Why were they painting the rocks white? Didn't you see what was going on? Why didn't you act? But if that next generation lives in a world where tens of millions of new jobs and opportunities are being created as the world gains momentum in shifting to renewable energy and much higher levels of efficiency and sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture, if they see a world in renewal, if they have hope in their hearts and they look at their own children and feel genuinely that their lives are going to be better still, I want them to look back at us and ask, how did you find the moral courage to rise up and solve a crisis that so many said was impossible to solve? And part of the answer will be that in the fall of 2010, a group of leaders from across society gathered in Lima, Peru, and became part of a growing global movement to do the right thing. We have everything we need, with the possible exception of political will. But political will is a renewable resource. Thank you. Gracias.